January 17th, 1940. The air is still, frozen hard over the outskirts of Augsburg, Germany. The light of a weak winter sun catches the glazed windows of the Messerschmitt factory. Inside, the work is precise, artisanal. Every rivet, every weld, is the mark of a skilled craftsman, measured and placed by hand. A small group of senior engineers, their faces etched with the confidence of men who believe they hold the secret to aerial warfare, examine the sleek lines of a newly finished Bf 109 fighter. They are building a war of quality, a finely honed engineering supremacy. They look west, across the dark expanse of the Atlantic, and see an industrial giant capable of producing washing machines and popular automobiles, but incapable of translating that brute force into the delicate, specialized art of combat aviation. They believe this war will be fought and won by the speed of their calculations and the flawless skill of their hands. They believe the enemy's hands are too soft, too focused on the trinkets of peacetime. This moment, in the cool, measured certainty of a German factory floor, defines the historical context of the coming storm. The military strategists of the Axis powers, rooted in old-world concepts of martial craftsmanship, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American power. To them, an airplane, a vessel of complex aerodynamics, high-tolerance metallurgy, and thousands of bespoke parts, was the antithesis of the assembly line. It was a cathedral of engineering, not a common warehouse. This deeply held conviction that America's consumer-driven industry was inherently incompatible with the demands of total war was the strategic oversight that would ultimately cost them the world. It was a fundamental misreading of the American machine, a failure to grasp that the very systems that put a Ford the Fifth Eight in every driveway could also put a four-engine bomber in every combat sky. The experts, both in Berlin and Tokyo, were absolutely certain. Mass production belonged on the ground, not 30,000 feet in the air. Yet, even as those engineers nodded in Augsburg, far across the ocean, a different kind of calculation was being made. In Detroit, Michigan, the heart of the American industrial empire, Henry Ford sat with his chief lieutenants. He saw the looming need for bombers, not dozens, but thousands. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was already on the drawing board, a potent, long-range heavy bomber destined to become the most produced American aircraft of the war. But the initial production process, rooted in the traditional methods of the aircraft industry, was glacial. The established manufacturers were custom building these planes in small, fixed jigs, replicating the artisanal methods of the enemy, only slower. The process was fragmented, inefficient, and slow, delivering planes one by one. The demand, however, was for a deluge. The Allied strategy, the very survival of Britain and the future liberation of Europe, demanded an air force capable of blotting out the sun. The requirement was not for a craft, but for a commodity. Ford looked at the B-24 blueprint and saw not an airplane, but a transportation problem. He saw it the same way he had once looked at the horseless carriage, a complex machine that could, and therefore must, be broken down into repeatable, interchangeable components, solvable by the relentless logic of the conveyor belt. His declaration was simple, and to the aviation world, utterly insane. He would build a single factory, a single operation, dedicated solely to the production of the B-24. He would apply the principles of the Model T, the moving assembly line, the interchangeable part, the sheer, crushing volume of standardized output, to a machine that cost $250,000 and contained 1 million separate pieces. The location chosen for this impossible venture was a remote stretch of farmland near Ypsilanti, Michigan, Willow Run. The sound that followed was the first symbolic measure of America's commitment to the coming fight. It was the rhythm of the industrial stamping press, a deep, metallic thud chank, followed by the hiss of steam and the roll of steel. This sound, previously reserved for bending the fenders and shaping the doors of family cars, was now redirected toward the thin, high-strength aluminum skins of the B-24. It was the heartbeat of a new war machine, echoing the cadence of peacetime abundance. It was the sound of democracy mobilizing its greatest asset, its capacity to produce, to replicate, to deliver not just freedom, but the sheer, overwhelming physical means to defend it. Willow Run itself was a project of unimaginable scope. Begun in the spring of 1941, it was built by an army of nearly 40,000 construction workers, rising from muddy fields with a speed that defied logic. When finished, it would be the largest factory building in the world under a single roof, a mile long, a quarter-mile wide, spanning 3.5 million square feet. To walk its length was to undertake a journey. This factory was not just about size. It was about rethinking the airplane itself. Instead of building the plane in one place, as a single, large, immovable object, Ford engineers sliced the B-24 into 5,000 major subassemblies. The nose, the fuselage sections, the bomb bay, the wing assemblies. Each part was treated like a fender or a door panel, built on its own line by specialized workers, and then funneled to a central, moving final assembly line. The core principle was revolutionary. Bring the work to the worker, not the worker to the work. The finished fuselage sections, too large to be moved on a typical belt, were carried by massive overhead cranes, gliding smoothly from their assembly jigs to the final line. It was the automotive principle writ large in the sky, but the journey from concept to reality was fraught with failure. The initial optimism of Ford collided head-on with the cold realities of aviation tolerance. Automotive parts could vary by a few millimeters. Aircraft parts required precision measured in thousandths of an inch. Ford's engineers, initially dismissive of aircraft-grade standards, found their first subassemblies failing to mate. Wings meant for the fuselage arrived warped. Rivets buckled. The sheer complexity of coordinating hundreds of thousands of parts from thousands of suppliers nearly brought the entire project to a standstill. In the initial months of 1942, the frustration was palpable. Henry Ford had promised 1B-24 an hour by the end of the year. Yet, the first few months yielded barely a handful of planes. The press, initially hailing Willow Run as the arsenal of democracy, quickly turned to cynicism, branding it Will It Run. The experts who had scoffed in Augsburg seemed momentarily vindicated. Mass production, they whispered, could not handle the soul of flight. But the American system, rooted in relentless iteration and problem-solving, would not yield. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius, took control. He was an apostle of the assembly line, a man who saw chaos as merely an unoptimized process. Sorensen systematically overhauled the entire operation. He standardized tools, redesigned jigs for simplicity, and, crucially, simplified the workforce structure. He implemented a system that allowed a high school graduate to perform a single, repetitive task with perfect consistency, feeding those tasks into a grand, seamless whole. As Willow Run struggled, the war was already turning brutally against the Axis's initial expectations. The Japanese soldiers, who had swept through the Pacific with astonishing speed, had been conditioned to believe in their own racial and spiritual superiority, expecting a protracted but ultimately successful negotiation with an American industrialist class more concerned with profits than patriotism. They believed the American spirit was soft, diluted by luxury. The German Wehrmacht, convinced of their blitzkrieg's invincibility, expected to defeat the European powers before the American sleeping giant could even rub the sleep from its eyes. They expected to fight a finite number of planes, a limited supply of fuel, and an enemy constrained by the democracy's inherent inefficiency. Then came the contrast. Imagine a German U-boat crewman watching from the surface of the North Atlantic as a seemingly endless stream of convoys sailed toward Britain. Then, the first American liberators, flying high and deep, began to patrol the oceans, closing the U-boat's hunting grounds. Or picture a Luftwaffe pilot, veterans of the Battle of Britain, looking up at the high, contrail-scarred sky over Schweinfurt and seeing the 8th Air Force, not a squadron, but a cloud, a formation of 1,000 bombers, so numerous they stretched to the horizon. Every bomber carried the undeniable evidence of Willow Run. The sheer, brute reality of American production began to rewrite the enemy's expectation. They had prepared for a chess match. America was playing poker with a bottomless stack of chips. The German propaganda machine, which had boasted of the Reich's industrial efficiency, now struggled to explain how the enemy, which they called decadent and soft, could produce machines of war faster than they could be shot down. This was the emotional core of the shift. The Axis soldier had prepared to fight an army of men. they found themselves fighting a factory. The sound of the stamping press at Willow Run, thousands of miles away, translated to the roar of four Pratt and Whitney engines over Europe and the Pacific. The relentless thud-chank of the assembly line was the mechanical manifestation of American resolve. By the summer of 1943, Willow Run had found its terrifying rhythm. The workforce, initially disorganized and largely unskilled, was now a disciplined army of production. The population shift alone was a transformation: farm boys from Iowa, Appalachian coal miners, and, most significantly, hundreds of thousands of women who stepped onto the factory floor, trading aprons for welding masks and shattering the ideological barriers of peacetime. The women of Willow Run, or Rosie the Riveters, were not just filling a gap. They were fundamentally proving the democratic model's resilience. In a fascist state, the mobilization of labor was a decree from above. In America, it was a voluntary, unified rush to a common cause, fueled by patriotism and, ironically, the promise of the consumer prosperity they were fighting to protect. The transformation was profound. The airplane, the symbol of elite, bespoke engineering, was now being built by common hands, by men and women whose highest previous mechanical ambition was fixing a tractor. The ideology shifted from the aristocratic notion of the master craftsman to the democratic principle of optimized, coordinated labor. They were proving that the complexity of modern warfare could be mastered not by singular genius, but by collective, organized, and standardized effort. The production figures became staggering. After the initial struggles, the ramp-up was exponential. In January 1944, Ford finally hit its target. 1B-24 Liberator rolled off the mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. A full-scale, four-engine heavy bomber, ready to fly, every hour. At its peak, Willow Run alone was producing more bombers than the entire Japanese aircraft industry combined. The sound of the stamping press, the deep, regular thud-chank that shook the Michigan soil, had become a metaphor for the sheer, relentless abundance of the American system. It wasn't just metal being shaped. It was the definitive answer to the Axis's challenge. Every repetition of that sound, every ton of aluminum bent and shaped, represented a plane that would carry 8,000 pounds of bombs and 10 men. A testament to a factory that turned a 4-year apprenticeship into a 4-hour training session to eye in the skies over the Pacific. Japanese pilots initially encountered American planes in limited numbers, viewing them as trophies for their superior Zero fighters. But as the war ground on, the air became thick with Corsairs, Hellcats, and, always, the high-flying Liberators. The psychological toll was immense. They had been told the American war machine was a slow, lumbering beast. The reality was a hydra, cutting off one head only to see two more instantly appear. The documents, the captured enemy diaries, and the intelligence reports all echoed a growing existential dread. The realization that the enemy's resources were not just vast, but infinite. The historical evidence is chillingly clear. The Axis war planning was predicated on the enemy's rational industrial capacity. They calculated that American companies, with their peacetime mentality and fragmented management, could not possibly overcome the tooling, training, and logistical hurdles to produce aircraft on a scale necessary to fight a truly global war. Ford disproved this with data points that were felt as explosions across the globe. By the time the war ended, Willow Run had produced 8,685 B-24 Liberators, nearly half of all B-24s ever made, demonstrating a capability that utterly transcended the automotive world it sprang from. The plane itself, often criticized as clumsy compared to the elegant B-17, was the perfect symbol of this industrial reality: rugged, mass-produced, and delivered in overwhelming numbers. Quantity, in this equation, was a quality all its own, a relentless, democratic flood against an elitist, engineered tide. The transformation of ideology was total. Willow Run demonstrated that the industrial efficiency created to provide a luxury, the personal car, could be instantly and devastatingly retasked to provide a necessity, the bomber. The assembly line, once an economic system, became a military weapon. It proved that democratic capitalism, far from being decadent and soft, possessed a scalable, adaptive, an overwhelming power that centrally planned economies could only dream of. The spirit that built the American middle class was the same spirit that won the war. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the war ended. The sound of the stamping press at Willow Run, which had hammered out the rhythm of victory, slowly began to fade. The mile-long line ground to a halt. The complex tooling, the massive assembly jigs, the specially designed cranes, they were all dismantled. The immense building, which had housed the hopes of democracy, was later converted back to its intended purpose, producing cars and transmissions, reverting from the arsenal of war to the heart of peacetime abundance, the memory of that vast, echoing space, where a bomber was born every hour, remains a poetic reflection on the true source of freedom's strength. The Japanese and German engineers had looked at American luxury and seen weakness. They saw a Ford V 8-engine block and dismissed it as a simple machine for common roads. They failed to see that the car, the refrigerator, the radio, and the washing machine, the entire spectrum of peacetime abundance, were merely the visible expressions of a deeper, unstoppable capability, a machine that could replicate perfection and deliver it to the masses. The B-24 Liberator, rolling out from the heartland of America, was not merely a weapon. It was a physical artifact of a prevailing ideology. It was the concrete proof that a society that valued the common man and gave him the tools to build a comfortable life possessed the organizational and technological depth to defend that life with overwhelming force. The factory had not just produced planes. It had produced a profound truth that the abundance of democracy, the very capacity to produce and share wealth and technology on a grand scale, was, in the end, the ultimate, insurmountable weapon. The car on the street and the bomber in the sky were inextricably linked, born of the same rhythm, forged by the same, powerful, continuous beat of the industrial stamping press, a sound that affirmed the triumph of collective, democratic ingenuity over the arrogance of single-minded, artisanal ambition. And in that sound, the world found its freedom.